Alright, so now in this video what we want to do is we really want to start to explore assigning materials in Maya and texturing the room. Now you'll notice we didn't paint the room in Mudbox, right? We painted all the other stuff in Mudbox that's in our room. The reason for that is because what we want to do is we want to explore tiling textures in the room. And that really means we can find just a pre-made texture, a texture that will repeat itself, right? You'll notice in one of the earlier Mudbox videos I kind of showed you how you could turn tiling on for the stencils, and what it did is it repeated that texture. That's exactly what tiling does inside of Maya, right? Now there's two ways to do it. You can actually do it through the material itself, which comes with some of its own drawbacks, or you can do it with the UVs. And I'll briefly kind of show you where both of those are at. We'll be using the one with the UVs though, because I find it's a little more flexible and a little easier to do and easier to find. So what is a seamless texture? Well, in this case, I'm going to bring up Chrome. And you'll see I kind of did a quick search for seamless wood floor texture. And really when you look at these textures, what you'll see is you want to kind of see a texture that basically repeats, right? You'll notice kind of the edges here kind of meet up on the same side elsewhere, and that'll make them seamless, right? Now, of course, you could do searches online, Google. You have to be careful though. Sometimes the formats will say weird, right? So really be careful that the format saved properly. Sometimes I've noticed occasionally that they'll save in a weird format that Mudbox won't recognize. But you'll notice kind of like here, see how this wood paneling lines up with this wood paneling, and this one kind of lines up with that one? That makes them seamless so that you won't see the edges, right? Now one of the things I also did is I did a quick search for, and you don't have to have it be wood floor texture, but probably not a bad idea for it, right? What you do is you could do a seamless wallpaper texture, right? You also can find some of these at textures.com, so if you really want to use textures.com, you'll probably be able to find those there as well. But you'll notice, particularly when we look at like the wallpaper, you'll notice that this wallpaper fundamentally repeats itself, right? You'll kind of see how when we actually click on it to see the proper texture, okay, it's gonna be a little bit of a butthead there. Let's click on that one a little easier. Now you notice this one has kind of this little watermarking in there, so you probably don't want to use that kind of texture, right? That's somebody making sure to say, hey, don't use this texture. But this is just an example, because you see how kind of the pattern here, like I love wallpaper for this very reason, because it really highlights the seamlessness of textures. You notice how this pattern here matches this one, so it's kind of like they got cut in half. So when you have this texture repeat, this side and this side will match, just like the top and the bottom will match. This is what makes a texture seamless. If you can get seamless textures for whatever you're doing, that's always ideal. Obviously, as you've seen with our painting, you don't really need them. There's other ways you can kind of get around that. But in particular for this one, we really want to just find some good generic wallpaper and wood floor that'll just repeat easily on its own. So in this case, we just kind of did some searching on the internet for a seamless texture, right? It just means that the textures kind of wrap around, they repeat themselves at the edges, so that when you have it repeat in the software, you can't see the seams. That's why they're called seamless, right? You can't see the edges. So I just kind of wanted to get that in there a little bit. Now, in this case, you see I'm back in Maya, and I've opened up the master room scene, and I'm just going to texture the room itself, right? So I just click on the room, right? And remember, we can use our isolate select, right? That kind of little blue dotted box with the little white cursor there. You just click on it just so it shows the room itself. Now, in this case, what we want to do is we want to apply our first material, right? We've exported. The last video, we exported files out of Mudbox, right? That's easy. That's just a picture. Now we have to get them back into Maya. That means we have to create materials for these objects, right? So each object that had a unique texture and unique UV should get its own unique material also. Right now, by default, all of the materials that are on every object in Maya are that default Lambert 1, that's that gray. So we need to assign a new material to the room. So how do you do that? Well, there are a couple ways. One is there is something called Hypershade, and we're not going to heavily rely on and use it here, but it's this little kind of teal ball, right? So it's kind of a little teal ball. You will find, though, it is in Windows rendering editors Hypershade, but I'll click on this little kind of ball. It's kind of right here with the renderers. We'll see that with our next videos. And you see what Hypershade does when you click on the little kind of teal ball is it brings this up. And this is your proper Maya material editor. These materials are kind of just some default stuff for particles and any other shader stuff. That Lambert 1 is that gray that's on everything. And so when you click on that material, you'll see it kind of brings the material ball up here. It brings some of the properties you can kind of create the textures for right there. Even other material types you can create right here. You can even, once this is clicked on, right, you can actually click on this like two little kind of double triangles one. And if you click on that with this selected, it shows you the shader network. So there's the Lambert material, and there's the actual full shading groups. Any textures we have to create, we plugged in over here. I'll kind of come back to that a little bit later today or in the next videos to kind of talk about that a little more. We're not really going to need to use the Hypershade that much, but I want to make sure you guys know that it's there and that's your full material editor, all right? We'll talk about it a little bit more later on, though. So I'm going to close that down. Make sure to click this, because there's another way that I often find easier, particularly if I'm just doing some basic material stuff. If you're going to get into some like hardcore, complicated shader stuff, you're going to want to use Hypershade. But if you're just plugging a couple of textures into a model, usually you don't have to necessarily use Hypershade if you don't want to. So there's another way to assign materials in Maya. If you select the object, right, just left click on the room, hold down right mouse button. Or, come on, there we go. Hold down right mouse button, right? So when you hold down right mouse button, it gives us our selection types, right? Vertex, edge, face, object mode. So we already kind of know about holding down right mouse button for these. But you guys have probably noticed that there's this whole other set of menus down here, right? And in fact, you'll see that there is the ability to assign a new material right from here, as well as even just go to the material properties. So in this case, I want to assign a new material, but this was just hold down right mouse button, right? You select an object, right? Hold down right mouse button over it, brings this up, and you just go down to assign new material. Now in this case, it brings this up. And you should have Arnold available, right? If there's the Arnold renderer here and here, you should be fine. Remember, if you're not seeing that, that can be a plugin not turned on. You guys are probably going to be fine because you're working at home and it's not kind of trying to find the license over the network. But if you need to, go to Windows, Settings, Preferences, Plugin Manager, right? Windows, Settings, Preferences, Plugin Manager, right? We kind of showed this off for the Unfold 3D if that wasn't on for whatever reason. And these are all the plugins that should be on for Maya when you install it. As you scroll down, you'll see the Modeling Toolkit's technically a plugin. You'll see Unfold 3D is a plugin. So for whatever reason, Unfold 3D is not showing up as an option in your Unfold stuff, turn that on. If Modeling Toolkit's not available, turn that on. But if we keep scrolling down, you'll see there's an area that says M2A. It's the solid angle section. That's Maya to Arnold. So you want to tell that to load and auto load. So that's how you get to that. Windows, Settings, Preferences, Plugin. Windows, Settings, Preferences, Plugin Manager. And just make sure to scroll down to where the mode is at so you can get Arnold. And that'll make the Arnold render available. We'll see that in some of our later videos this week. But it also makes the Arnold material available. But when you do that assign new material, it brings this up, right? And we're going to see two more videos, not today. I'm going to do one more for our next class session. That's going to be applying a bunch of the other materials on here and using presets. It'll be great practice, and it'll be a video just dedicated to this, not just tiling textures. And I'm also going to show you some brief basic lighting stuff and rendering for Arnold. And that'll be kind of our next two videos for later in the week. So in this case, we don't want to use the default materials that Maya is giving us. Blinn, Lambert, Phong. Oftentimes you'll even see like an anisotropic, like if I click on all the Maya ones here, you'll see even more, right? Stingray, which is kind of Maya's own custom real-time physically based shader system. We're not going to use that here though. You'll see there's things like anisotropic, which is a physical property of light. These are kind of the old Maya materials, right? We don't really want to use those, right? Because one of the things they added recently was Arnold. Arnold's kind of their new main renderer. These are really kind of built to use the older renderers or Maya's own software renderer. And Maya's own software renderer is really not terribly good. It's actually quite bad. Arnold is in itself a pretty awesome renderer. So what we're going to use is, instead of using the default Maya materials, we're going to click on the Arnold thing right here. Because you kind of see that when this assign new material thing comes up, it's got kind of like your filter on this left side and then the actual materials on this side. So we'll click on the Arnold filter, and you see there's actually a lot in here. Now, we're not going to have to worry about most of these, but you'll see there's an ambient occlusion shader, a car paint shader. You'll see that there is a wireframe shader, which is really cool for doing wireframe renders. We're not going to worry about that semester, though. But there is something called AI standard surface, and that's kind of the default main kind of surface type in Arnold, and that's what we're going to use. So we're going to click on AI standard surface, and that actually applies this new material here. Now, you might have noticed in the video that something popped up and then disappeared here. Maya's like that a little bit, right? So what we're going to want to do when we want to start to work with materials a lot more is instead of using things like channel box layer editor or modeling toolkit, we're going to switch to attribute editor, right? And we've occasionally seen attribute editor a little bit, but we'll get to kind of take a more of a look at it here, right? This really shows you the properties for the whole object, right? Channel box layer editor really just shows you layer stuff. We'll talk about that a little more on our troll project for our final project, project 6. And of course, it has your little transforms for the objects, and it has your history right here, right? Any things you do to the model will be in your history. So we kind of know channel box layer editor, modeling toolkit, of course, and we've seen and dabbled with attribute editor a little bit. But we're really going to get to see it more here. But this is where certain properties are at, like render stats are in here. Sometimes your smooth mesh, you might accidentally turn on displacement preview, right? So if you ever have your smooth preview on and the control cage is up and you can't turn it off, you accidentally hit the quick key. I think it's like control 3. It's something like control 3 or something like that, instead of its regular 3 or alt 3, something like that. And it turns this on. You just have to go back to your object, attribute editor, smooth mesh, displacement preview, turn that off. And then I usually just turn this back on, and then your smooth preview will work normally. But just some of the stuff you can actually, properties you can actually see for the object right there. What we want is we want the material properties, though. We're not really seeing them right here. You actually can kind of see here, there's some other room properties, there's the some room properties, and then there's actually your standard surface right there. So you can actually see it is here in these tabs. But another way you can actually bring this up, right, is if you hold down right mouse button over your object, you can actually go to material attributes, right? Instead of assigning to material, because we've already done that, you go to material attributes. And what that does is that brings those material properties up. Now in this case, you see how we can label it. So I can just call this room, right? There we go. Hit enter, there's room. And you'll see that there's a bunch of material properties in here. Now for us, we don't really have to worry about these too much. The only thing I'd say to probably worry about right now before plugging some textures in is specular, right? So when you see when you first bring up your material attributes, there's base, and that's your color property, right? That's actually where your color map's going to go, is in the base section. There is the specular section, and sometimes you can only see that, and you see specular color, and you might plug it into specular color on accident and go, why can't I see my color map? You plugged it into specular color when you wanted to plug it into base color, right? Now in this case, our wallpaper, and we're going to do the wallpaper first and then assign another material for the floor. We want the specular to be 0 for the wallpaper. We don't really want our wallpaper to be shiny. And that's what specular is. That's shininess, reflection. So we're going to turn the weight for specular down to 0. Weight is usually kind of the amount, right? And then with the actual color you want the specular to be, and to a certain extent, like the intensity would be here. Like if you painted a spec map on Mudbox, you'd plug it into specular color. And that would say, be specular here, don't be specular here, as well as any specular color you want it to have. That's one of the things I kind of dropped out for this project because, you know, we can still cover just about everything we want to cover, and I just want to simplify the project a little for you guys. But you can plug your specular maps from Mudbox into there. Usually if you do, though, you'll turn up your index of refraction to show it a lot more when you render, and maybe a little bit of roughness just to make it spread over the surface more. All right, but we just have color maps for this, right? So we're going to go to color section and base. And you'll see there's a little checkerboard here, right? So we're going to click on that checkerboard. And when we click on the color checkerboard for base, it brings this up. Very similar to our material one, except it's for textures. You have a filter on this side, so these are kind of just like the material one. There's a filter on the left side, and then the right side is the actual, in this case, texture. But if it was the material one, it's the materials. Now you see a lot of textures in here. Some of these are procedural textures from Maya, right? These are math-based, right? You actually apply them, and Maya creates them using math and algorithms, right? And it actually just has a bunch of sliders, and you play with those sliders to have it randomize stuff. So those are procedural textures. The great thing about those is they always have infinite resolution because it's not an actual fixed 2048 pixel JPEG or PNG or Targa. They do tend to look a little bit CG-ish, right? But they can be really cool if you're doing like, you know, noise or like a checkerboard and things like that. We're not really addressing procedurals this semester, but Maya does have its own procedurals. What we wanted is we wanted the fourth one down, right? Called file, right? So there's bulge, there's checker, there's cloth, and then there's file. That's the one we want. So we click on file, and now you'll see it brings us to this. And you'll notice this looks a heck of a lot like our free image planes, right? So when we create a free image plane in Maya, it uses our references for models, it brings up pretty much this, and that's basically what this is. This is your ability to pick and load an image into Maya, whatever it is, right? In this case, it's for a material and textures. For your image plane, it's for reference images. So I click on checkerboard, or not checkerboard, but the little folder, right? And then what we could do is we can go back out. Now by default, it goes to the source images folder. So if you really, really wanted to put your textures in your source images folder, you can. But I'm going to go back out to images, and there's all of our textures. Now in this case, you'll notice I saved wallpaper and wood floor already into this project. So when you download those, save them into the project itself, because then they'll be easy to find, and if you need to move stuff around. And we want to do this as our wallpaper one. So I'm going to hit open, and now we have wallpaper texture plugged in. Now, you notice how we're not seeing it on the model? That's because in Maya, right, 4 is wireframe, 5 is shaded, 6 is textured. So remember, 4 wireframe, 5 shaded, 6 textured. Now, you'll notice we had to create a material first. Materials are basically the gatekeepers inside of Maya, really any software, right? You can actually, and you'll see this on some of our parts of our models, you can actually just apply a material without any texture at all if you're just looking for really, really simple color, right? Many kind of computers and cell phones really just have that simple color that's got some shininess. You don't necessarily need texture for that. And we'll see that for like our copper and our brass stuff, and even kind of a little bit of the plastic underneath our chair. So your material itself is what is actually telling the model what color to be, how shiny to be, how transparent to be, and you can do that without textures. We're just using the textures to control that at the level of the pixel, right? So the material itself is what actually tells the object what properties of a material to have, right? Reflection, transparency, glow. So materials actually are what's telling Maya and Maya's camera and the lights how to interact with that. You're just using the texture to control it at a really fine level, right? So that's what the texture really is. We're saying, hey, I know I could do this without a texture, but I want to be able to say, be darker brown here, be kind of lighter tanned here. Textures really give you the ability to control the color or transparency at a very small, fine-tuned level, the level of the pixel. But materials themselves are what's actually telling Maya's renderer and lights how to create the surface, right? The material properties of the surface. And you're just using a texture to control that at a more precise level. So there we go. But in this case, you notice how some of my wallpaper is large and some of it's small? Well, there's 2 ways to control that tiling of this. One of the ways is where we're already here, right? When we just plugged in our texture, we could see that there's the file and here's our texture. But you'll notice right next to it is place 2D texture, right? If I click on that, you'll notice that you actually have a repeat function right here. Now, we're not actually going to use this, but I'm going to show you really quickly. If I say type in 10 by 10, you notice how it repeats that wallpaper texture a lot? And you notice because the texture is seamless, you see how it repeats without seams, without the edges showing? That's what's really cool about seamless textures. Now in this case, you'll notice though that these are larger than these. And there's no real way to control that unless you created a separate material for every wall. I don't want to do that. So yes, you can control the tiling through place 2D texture right here, but there's another way to control it. And I feel like it gives you a little more direct control. You'd also have to do this repeating for every texture you're plugged in. So if you had a couple of other material properties like a bump map, you'd have to go in here and save the same repeat numbers in there. The UV way actually allows you to control it at the level of each shell instead of having to create a material for each one. And it'll do it for any of the textures because you're tiling the UVs themselves. So I'm going to click on the model. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to our UV editing workspace, right? So we go to workspace, we click on My Classic up here, we go to UV editing, and there's our UVs. Now in this case, I'm going to turn my distortion grid off because I really don't want that on anymore. And what I want to do is, you notice how we kind of, when we unwrap this, we just left everything on top of each other. We didn't worry about packing it terribly awesome. That's because I knew we were going to come back and do the texture in a different way. Now we noticed when we UV unwrapped everything before, we always wanted to make sure it was in the quadrant. It wasn't going in other quadrants because that'll do weird stuff with trying to create a separate texture just for that little area. And we wanted no overlap, right? Here, since it is the same texture on every wall, overlap's okay. Also, because this texture was not painted to match the UVs, it's a generic seamless texture, we can actually scale these UVs bigger than the quadrant and it'll still work. So what I'm about to do, is a bad idea to usually do for most texturing. But if it's tiling for wallpaper or floor, it's actually okay. So in this case though, I want to kind of control each shell on its own. Now, one of the cool ways you can actually do this is if you go into your 3D view here, right? If you hold down your right mouse button, it brings up your selection types, right? And of course, assign new material and stuff. But you'll see there's a UV section. And if you go into that, it brings these up, and there's one called UV shell, right? So just to repeat that, if you hold down your right mouse button over an object, you can go to the UV section of your selections, and then UV shell, and you'll notice it allows you to select just the UV shells. And when you do that, you can then move your cursor to the UV editor, hit R for scale, right? Good old R for scale, and you just scale this shell up. And you notice as we scale this shell up, it's getting bigger than the quadrants, which usually, most of the time, is a no-no, right? You don't want to do that, particularly if you've painted a texture in Mudbox or Substance Paint or whatever. Don't do that. But in this case, we didn't. We just found a generic, seamless texture that would repeat. And you notice how this image is now repeating. So often quite popular for games, you can repeat your textures, right? You don't paint a giant 50,000 pixel brick wall for just one building. What you do is you have a couple of different smaller brick textures that you can tile. And that way you can take a 1024, or even in this case, I think it's like a 250 pixel by 250 pixel texture, and make it act a lot bigger. Because it's one single texture that's on all the walls, and you can tile it so that it repeats. And that way, all you have to load in RAM, all that has to be on your Blu-ray disc for, or your download for your video game, is just that smaller texture, and then you kind of let the engine or Maya do the rest. So that's one of the great things about tiling textures, and you tend to see it a lot for large environmental pieces, buildings, roads, right, where you're not just creating this massive, unbelievably huge texture asset, right? You're kind of like, well, we're gonna create a smaller one and have it repeat a lot, right? So this is what tiling textures allows you to do, is use a smaller texture that you can then have it repeat over the model. So I click on this shell, and you see how kind of it's just showing the normal texture, but as we make it bigger, it repeats the texture. And notice how we can kind of get it to the exact size. If you hit W, you can move it around. You can even rotate it, right? E for rotate. And you see how you have full control over each shell. This is why I like using the UV editor for this. Not only do you have the ability to, whatever texture is on here, it'll do for all the textures, but you have a lot of direct control without having to create separate materials for this. Now remember, I'm just selecting shell by holding down right mouse button, UV shell, and it's just on, so I can select the shell I want to work with. Then we can just scale it up. And like you said, because we made sure to find this as a seamless texture, you know, it's how kind of the edges are identical on kind of this side matches with this side, it repeats seamlessly. But that's all we're doing is by making the UVs bigger, it actually takes this texture and it's here and it's here, and it's just repeating the texture, right? And we're just using this scale to make those UVs bigger to have it repeat the texture. So this is a great way to just kind of have, to take advantage of tiling textures for your environments, right? And that's why we didn't do it for like things like our room, for our clock, because we didn't want to do that, right? We wanted a unique texture for that, right? So for this though, we didn't, right? We just wanted a kind of generic wallpaper that we could tile across everything, kind of keep it everything about the same size. Let me make that a little bit bigger. There we go. And it's a great way to kind of show us that we can select UV shells, we can tile them up, and we just get all of our kind of tile textures in pretty good shape. So there we go. So that's tiling textures, right? In this case, I'm going to save my scene really quick, right? Continue. And what I want to do is I want to create the floor. Now the nice thing is UV shell selection is already on, right? So I can, you know, hold down right mouse button, UV shell, and I can just click the floor polygons, right? So now only the polygons for the floor are selected. Now, if my camera is zoomed in close enough so that you really can see that this shell's selected, what I can do is I can hold down right mouse button again, right? And instead of going to UV shell or those, I can go to assign new material, because I want a different texture and a different material for the floor. So we hold down right mouse button, we go assign new material. It brings up this, right? And we can click on Arnold. and the little Arnold filter here. And then we can go to AI standard surface. And now you see how there's a whole new material on here that's not getting in the way of this one. Now, of course, in this case, I can go to hold down right mouse button, material attributes instead of assigning material. And it brings up the material properties here. So we can call this floor, right? And notice how you can kind of do this even with your UV editing up, because it'll bring your attribute editor up here when you hold down right mouse button and go to material attributes. But I did do assign new material to create the new material. And there, of course, is our base color section, because this is an AI standard surface. So what I can do is go to the checkerboard. Those checkerboards always indicate that you can plug something in. So you notice how you can plug in tons of different textures from Arnold standard surface. And we'll see some of these other ones later on. So I'll click on checkerboard for the color base color section checkerboard. And then we can go, and of course it brings this up, right? We can click on File, the fourth one down, File. And in this case, I'm going to click back on File 2 here because it was in the kind of the place 2D texture from last time. So we'll click back on File 2. So you notice how you have these little tabs in your attribute editor. And there's that little folder, right? Image name folder. So I can click on that. And in this case, we'll find wood floor. And we'll hit open. There we go. Now in this case, this is going to be kind of a lacquered wood floor, so we don't have to necessarily worry about putting a bump map on it, right? If you want to, you can. But we'll kind of go over bump maps and how to plug those in on the later videos, right? Now in this case, I need to tile this, right? Because this isn't that's a kind of pretty big wood grain. So remember, hold down right mouse button, UV shell. I can select the shell. R for scale, but you just notice I'm just going to scale in the UV editor, right? We're scaling in the UV editor itself. And I can scale this up, and you see how it kind of repeats that wood floor? So now, that one smaller wood floor texture now covers and repeats, right? So this texture repeats here, repeats here, repeats here, repeats here. That's what tiling is, right? The texture actually repeats itself. By scaling this bigger than the actual image, it forces it to repeat to cover all that stuff. And you can see this can be really great and really cool for how we kind of tile textures for stuff. In this case, you can kind of make the tiling as big or small as you want. I think it was a little bit big there. So that'll work pretty well, I think. And now, of course, we can go back to My Classic. And we can zoom out a little bit, maybe set to object mode. And what you can do is you can see that we now have, I'll turn Isolate Select off. You see we now have our wallpaper and our floor. And we didn't have to paint those textures, right? This was really just kind of tiling textures. We found some pre-made ones, slapped them on there, and now we can see they repeat nice, they look good on the model. So not all texturing has to be painted by hand, right? Particularly if it's environmental stuff, you'll often just find great, seamless, tileable brick or wood or wallpaper or concrete to actually have it repeat in your game engine, or in this case in Maya. Alright, so I think that's a great place to stop for that. And like I said, we'll do some more videos for how to assign the textures and new materials to these other things. So we'll do more material stuff and texture assigning on our next video. But that should be good.